pale moon rose its glory out on the western town. She told a sad, sad story of the great ship that went down. 'Twas the 14th day of April, over the waves she rode, sailing into tomorrow, to a golden age foretold. Welcome to Songs of Experience, a Bob Dylan podcast where we explore the man and the music one song at a time. I'm your host, Henry Bernstein, and I'm very pleased to welcome my guest and dear friend, acclaimed filmmaker and proud Chicagoan, Michael Glover Smith, here to talk about Bob Dylan's 2012 title track off of the same album, Tempest. Michael, hello, you're here.
Henry, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be the guest on, your inaugural episode of this podcast.
Yeah, who knows? It might be the only one. I guess we'll find
The
out.
first and last.
Yeah.
But much like the voyage of the Titanic.
There you go.
The maiden voyage was the final voyage.
Yeah, let's hope the end of Tempest is better than the end of Titanic. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, Michael, is how you got into Bob Dylan.
So that's a pretty simple story. The first time I was ever conscious of hearing his voice was when I saw the video for the song Handle with Care by the Traveling Wilburys. It was on either VH1 or MTV back in 1988 when it was a new song. And so Dylan was, he was middle-aged at that point. But the funny thing is, I grew up on early rock and roll music because my father is a music fanatic. But he was born in 1947 in a small town in North Carolina. And so he didn't listen to Bob Dylan, but he loved 1950s rock and roll and early 60s rock and roll and R&B music. And he also loved folk music. Henry, this is the crazy thing. He was in a folk music trio when he was in high school, him and two of his buddies.
What did he sing, play guitar?
He sang and played guitar, and he still has this beautiful old Gibson guitar from like 1962.
Oh, wow.
But, because he lived in Albemarle, the music he listened to was Peter, Paul, and Mary, the Kingston Trio, the kind of more clean-cut, mainstream folk music. But so I would have heard Blowin' in the Wind, but the Peter, Paul, and Mary version. So I had no clue that Dylan wrote that song. I would listen to that and Puff the Magic Dragon and all those kind of songs growing up. And I must have heard Dylan singing We Are the World in 1985, but I didn't know who he was. The first time I was conscious that I was listening to Bob Dylan was when the Traveling Wilburys came out.
What a great introduction to Bob Dylan. That
I know.
Your introduction to Bob Dylan was with George Harrison.
Yeah.
And Tom Petty.
Right. And Roy Orbison.
And Roy Orbison, of course. And let's not forget Jeff Lynne.
Right.
So did you just then over time grow to love him? When did you become...
It was pretty soon after because I bought Highway 61 on cassette tape.
That was your first album.
That was my first album because I loved the Dylan songs on Traveling Wilburys so much that I, felt like I needed to explore his catalog. And then I became aware of the fact that Like a Rolling Stone was his, greatest song.
Right.
So I remember going to the record store in the mall and, kind of finding that tape, seeing that Like a Rolling Stone was on there and buying it and bringing it home. But the first time I ever heard it, I was it was I'd never heard it before. And I, pressed play on the little boombox in my bedroom, and
Like a Rolling Stone came out.
That famous snare shot, which Bruce Springsteen said is like someone kicking open the door to your mind.
Right.
Great turn of phrase.
Sort of like how Bob Dylan must have felt, hearing Johnny Cash or Elvis.
Exactly. Little Richard
or Little Richard,
Chuck Berry.
That's amazing. So okay, before we get into the song Tempest, I want to talk about why we're here together.
Yeah.
So you and I met in a very niche, magical place called Dylan Twitter.
That's right.
And during the pandemic, I would say, when, we all sort of were in it, and, maybe you and I interacted a little bit before, but it really wasn't until then, probably post Murder Most Foul, Rough and Rowdy Ways. And, discovered we had a mutual friend in Skokie Man, aka Aaron Wertheimer.
That's right.
A very, very good editor and filmmaker himself and writer. And since then, we learned also of our shared love of seeing Bob live. And of course, since then have seen Bob together now a few times, like,
Quite a few times.
like literally one time sitting one seat apart, but a couple other times at the same shows intentionally. So tell me a little bit about your history of seeing Bob Dylan live.
Okay, so the first show I saw was actually in 1989. So not long after I started listening to Bob. It was August of 89 in Charlotte, North Carolina. And here's the funny thing. Dylan's reputation was probably at a lower point in 88, 89, the early years of the Neverending Tour.
Like before Oh Mercy?
It was right before Oh Mercy
Okay.
came out, but he had recorded it. So, Oh Mercy, of course, was the comeback album.
Right.
But I saw him in an amusement park in Charlotte, North Carolina called Carowinds, the
Oh my God.
Carowinds Palladium.
Oh my
So
God.
there's like a little outdoor amphitheater which is inside the amusement park. And on the day of the show, you could either go only to the show, or you could get like a discounted ticket where you could go ride the rides in the amusement
And then
park
go to the
and then go
concert.
to the concert, which like gave you a discount on the concert. And so my buddy Franklin and I did that. We were like, 13, 14 years old, and we were both big Dylan fans. We kind of got into Bob together. So we rode all the roller coasters. The famous roller coaster at Carowinds at that time was called Scooby Doo. It was like a Scooby Doo themed roller coaster. So we rode that, and then we went and saw the show at night.
That's like a theme time radio hour episode.
Exactly. Pure Americana.
Right, right.
But we loved the show. And the funny thing was, I think we were in like the 9th row, but we weren't even trying to get good seats.
Right.
We just bought them, kind of like shortly after they went on sale. It's not like today where you're logging on and trying to get it within the first 30 seconds. So it was kind of, things were different back then.
Right.
But we both loved the show. The set list was incredible. He played, and the funny thing was, I probably had maybe 7 or 8 albums at that point. I didn't have all of them, but one of the ones I had was the self-titled album from '62, and he played 2 songs off of it. He played Man of Constant Sorrow and Pretty Peggy-O.
Oh my God. Wow.
And so, I love those songs. And to me, that just felt natural. It's like, oh yeah, that's his first album. Like,
Right.
These are famous songs.
Right. You didn't know those were rarities.
I didn't know they were rarities
Yeah.
at all. I had no clue.
You probably didn't even know he didn't write Man of Constant Sorrow. Pretty Peggy.
I mean, I had never seen set lists of any of his shows.
Right.
So I had no clue what to expect, but I loved the show.
And would you say from that point on, you were sort of hooked on seeing him live, or did you have like periods of
No,
not seeing him live?
That happened gradually because I had just turned 14. And by the way, that tour was Tony Garnier's first tour as
God.
bassist, summer of '89.
Wow.
So yeah, I've been seeing not only Bob, but Bob and Tony for the past, 35 years.
Basically as long as Bob has been seeing Tony.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I did see another show the following year, because this is the beginning of the Neverending Tour, and he played all the same.
He just looped around.
He came back to Charlotte. So I saw him on Halloween night, 1990. And at that point, Under the Red Sky had just came out, which I bought, on September 11th, 1990, the day it came out. So he was playing a lot of those songs. He played Wiggle Wiggle and TV Talkin' Song. And I loved it. As a 15-year-old, I thought that album was great.
That answers my next question.
I didn't know I was supposed to be disappointed in it. I was too young to know the difference.
What did we know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then there was a gap. I didn't see him again for another 4 years.
Okay, so until you were 18 or so.
Yeah, I went to a performing arts high school for my senior year in Winston-Salem to study acting. And then I moved to Chicago to go to DePaul also for acting. And I didn't see Dylan again until '94. Okay. And then, and that was a show in Indiana. Me and a couple of my buddies drove down to Merrillville to the Star Plaza Theater and saw him play. And that's when he had Bucky, in the band, really kind of fleshing out the sound with the steel guitar. Whereas the first 2 shows I saw, that was like the minimalist, garage rock, almost punky
Wow.
years
Was
of the
G.E.
Never.
Smith in the band?
I saw G.E. Smith was the guitarist for both of the first two shows that I saw.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
kind of like a grungy
it
band.
was. Yeah.
Who was on drums then?
The first show was Christopher Parker
Oh,
in
interesting.
'89, and
He
then
didn't last long.
I can't remember who it was
Yeah.
in '90. I'd have to look it
Wow.
up.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So you saw that unplugged version of the band, basically.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
94 also.
Exactly. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. I wanted to ask you one more question about seeing Bob live. Have you seen any Tempest songs live?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the
And I mean Tempest the album, of
Tempest
course.
the
Well,
album.
and I'll
Yeah. I mean,
explain shortly why I mean just the album.
I've seen a lot of shows from 2013 through the present. So he was doing a lot of Tempest songs,
Yeah.
especially, in the early part of that section of the Neverending
Well,
Tour.
I can assume you've seen many because you've seen more shows than me, and even in the period of time where we overlap seeing lots of shows, you've seen more shows than me. You're a Dylan traveler far, longer than I have been. But I've seen 37 Tempest songs. That includes 10 early Roman kings,
Wow.
9 Soon After Midnight, 7 Pay in Blood, 4 Duquesne Whistle, 4 Long and Wasted Years, and 3 Scarlet Towns.
Wow.
I'm sure you have seen those. So
But
Tempest,
but wait, Henry,
yeah,
let me jump in.
yeah.
Isn't that all of the songs he's played off the album, with the exception of Roll on John, which he only did twice
Yeah,
in England?
very
Yeah.
good. Tempest, along with Tin Angel and Narrow Way, are the only songs on this album not played live. And as you said, Roll on John, the final track, was only played twice. So yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
what I guess my point is that he, during that period of time, 2012 on, he played a lot of Tempest songs.
Yes.
So, I mean, like sort of the playing the songs on your album, much like he did in '06 with Modern Times, and he didn't play live. Tempest, I think there is a good reason for that. So, Tempest, the album was recorded in Santa Monica between January and March of 2012, and it included, along with Bob's regular band of Tony Garnier, Donnie Heron, Stu Kimball, George Rosselli, and Charlie Sexton, it included the Los Lobos guitar, accordion, violin player, David Hidalgo, which is what gives it kind of that Mexican flair.
Totally. And in fact, that was the third album in a row that David Hidalgo had played on of Bob. So I always think of those as like a trilogy.
Oh, totally.
It's like Together Through Life, Christmas in the Heart, and Tempest. They all have accordion on
The accordion is like what's binding them together.
Exactly.
This song, it clearly is carrying a tradition of the Carter song, The Titanic. And Bob has been open and out about that. I mean, he said famously in Rolling Stone in 2012, I was just fooling with that one night. I liked the melody. I liked it a lot. Maybe I'm going to appropriate this melody, but where would I go with it? So Bob is like kind of hitting us over the head with the whole folk music thing. And, you and I were talking briefly about that whole, the idea of like the folk music carrying on, and certainly the tradition of a Titanic song. So before we get into why Tempest for you, why we're talking about Tempest, do you want to tell me a little bit about that sort of tradition of singing Titanic songs?
Oh, yeah. So it's funny that you bring that up, because I was just doing research into folk songs about the Titanic. And one of the things that I learned is there are actually a lot of songs about the Titanic. The Carter family song is probably like the most famous one today, but there's an even earlier one called When That Great Ship Went Down.
Mm-hmm.
And
is that the one?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like a children's campfire song, But I learned something really interesting, that there's a version of that song on Harry Smith's Anthology of American Folk Music, which is by a husband and wife duo, William and Versie Smith. And they were gospel singers and blues singers. And obviously that's not a gospel song, but their version is killer. William Smith has a real gravelly voice. He sounds kind of like Charlie Patton or Blind Willie Johnson. And then his wife kind of sings along, kind of chimes in and he's playing the guitar like in a very percussive style, and then she's playing the washboard.
Oh, awesome.
And so it's really, really great, but it's really upbeat and it's really joyous, which is kind of in ironic counterpoint to the lyric.
Right. Right.
Because it makes you want to dance,
Right.
and then the chorus is, wasn't it sad
Right.
when that great ship went down? So anyway, I found this incredible blog called My Old Weird America, which is kind of a riff on the title of Greil Marcus's book about the basement tapes, and Harry Smith's anthology. And this is what I learned. I'm just going to quote this. Unfortunately, I don't know the author's name because their real name is not on the blog. But anyway, this is what they
go to the blog.
Go to My Old Weird America, and here's the entry about this song. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 was an event that made a big impression on people's minds, as it was one of the first in a series of disasters in the modern world that showed the vulnerability of man's creation against God's creation, nature. Soon after the event, songs began to circulate, and some were put in print on broadside papers. For many singers, the disaster was a kind of modern Tower of Babel, God punishing man's arrogance, especially among Black singers who saw in the disaster God's punishment for the segregational policies of the boat's company because Blacks were not allowed on board. And I just want to quote you one verse from that song, which illustrates this point. This is from the second verse. While they were building, they said what they would do. We will build a ship that water can't go through. But God, with power in hand, showed the world that it could not stand. And I think that kind of set the template, that verse in particular, for how not only people sang about the Titanic, but also kind of how they view it as a narrative, which is almost like, it's the ship itself is kind of a symbol of man's hubris. It's kind of like, oh, they said it was unsinkable. So, God sort of cut them down.
Right.
It's almost like an Icarus story.
Right. Yeah, they flew too close to the sun, but
exactly.
the opposite way. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, that really sort of illustrates what's so interesting about things that Bob has done, from his first album, like you talked about earlier, to his most recent, which is putting his stamp on major events in human history in the way that the Great American Songbook does, or traditional music does. Throughout his career, we've seen him do that. Like, Bob Dylan deserves a place in singing a song about the Titanic, about the Kennedy assassination.
Right.
Singing all of those, what we call Sinatra songs, but they weren't written by Frank Sinatra, like putting his stamp on what this is. And it's also being part of a Carter song. There's just that great folk lineage there.
Yeah. Going back to the earliest days of recorded music.
Absolutely. And I just love that. This, of course, is Dylan's third longest song, behind only 1997's Highlands off of Time Out of Mind, and of course Murder Most Foul, which one could say it's on Rough and Rowdy Ways. I would say it's its own thing, but that's for another time.
You're one of those.
I don't know. It's sort of disc 2. It's like Rough and Rowdy Ways at Jace. But what's funny, just real quick, Murder Most Foul and Highlands, just in terms of statistics, are only apart by about 20 seconds.
Right.
So, and Dylan has no shortage of long songs, but this one certainly is. I mean, it sort of is the length to which the subject deserves.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it actually has 45 verses. They're short, they're 4-line stanzas.
Right.
But there's 45 of them. So it's an epic. It's an epic song.
It's an epic. Why did you pick this one? When I asked you to come talk to me about a song, why Tempest?
So I've always loved this song. I bought the album on the day it was released, September of 2012. And it immediately kind of stood out to me. I mean, I loved the whole album, but due to the extreme length, and also I think just due to his vocal performance and the lyrics, which are so wild.
Mhm.
You know, it's such a bizarre song. I just fell in love with it, and I was surprised that not everyone felt that way. To me, it was the best song on the album. Um,
It was very polarizing.
it was polarizing.
Like, like the New York Daily News said it, it's like one of the worst things he's ever done. Unfortunately, you have to sit through 14 minutes, but Rolling Stone loved it.
Right,
So
right.
it's like, yeah.
And I think what people didn't like about it, they thought it was too long, or they thought it was too monotonous
Mhm.
because it's just nothing
It's
but verses. There's no chorus, there's no bridge.
There's no solo except
Yeah.
at the beginning, that little violin intro, which I wondered, was that David Hidalgo on violin or Donnie Herron? But Hidalgo is probably playing accordion. So,
But Donnie Herron there's a steel guitar on it as well.
oh,
So
sure.
either did he overdub one of those two parts?
I don't know.
We don't know.
I mean, musically, it is a very simple song.
Yeah.
It's three chords, G, C, and D, and it's not even in a weird key. Like Bob does it in G,
Yeah.
and it's not in like A flat or something like if he was doing it live. But and it just marches along. And to me, Michael, like there's something about it where when it starts and I see the time, I'm sort of like, oh boy, here we go. Am I going to make it?
Yeah.
and I can't turn it off. Like
Yeah.
after every verse, it's just, oh, I want to hear what happens next. I read the first two verses, but then he goes on. The night was bright with starlight. The seas were sharp and clear, moving through the windows. The promised hour was near, and that just sort of makes you, well, what's going to happen next? Like,
right.
And you think that's like an incredible thing about this song.
I totally agree. And you know who else agrees with you is my wife. Now, Jill is not a hardcore fan. She's not like us. She's more like your wife.
Right.
And but she likes Dylan. She just doesn't feel the need to, own every album, go to every show.
Right.
But I remember when it came out, I played the song for her and she loved it.
Really?
And she said, yeah, she goes, this song is so great. It's like listening to an audiobook.
Yes. It is like an audio drama.
It is. And that kind of brings me to the other thing about it that was really surprising at the time is it's a narrative song.
Right.
And that was kind of something Bob was exploring for the first time in a long time, was narrative songwriting.
Right.
Because
this happened, then this happened, then this happened.
Exactly.
Like,
and he
Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll.
Exactly. But he does that on other songs on Tempest. I mean,
Yeah.
Roll On John has a narrative, and especially Tin Angel.
Yes.
Tin Angel is, a story song about three characters. It's a love triangle. It ends with a double murder and a suicide. Yeah, it's a murder ballad.
Yeah.
It's a modern murder ballad, and that was kind of surprising because all of the albums of original material from Time Out of Mind in '97 through Together Through Life, he had this more like postmodern approach of sort of like cut and paste, where he's just taking lines and phrases from other songs, from movies, from books he's reading, and he kind of create something new by synthesizing. But the point has been made by some critics that it's almost like you could take lines or even entire stanzas from one song and swap them out with another song, and it really wouldn't make a difference. Right. So, all of those songs from Time Out of Mind through Together Through Life are kind of abstract in a way. And then to kind of get a song about the Titanic, which is a subject based on a real historical event that's very concrete, that was surprising at the time. But what's interesting about Tempest is it's not really one narrative. It's like a bunch of different fragments of narratives, right? It's almost like every verse in that song is its own little story. Sometimes characters will appear in multiple verses, but oftentimes he'll just sing about characters in one verse and then they disappear.
Right.
So I always liken this song to like a Hieronymus Bosch painting.
Okay.
Like the Garden of Earthly Delights or something, where there's just like dozens and dozens of characters in the canvas, and your eye can kind of wander around and you can kind of pick and choose what you want to focus on, and it's like there are all these different stories being told. And that's to me how the song works.
It's interesting what you said about the the different characters in it. I was thinking about the Leo line.
Yes.
So, and Bob even had a quote about it. So I'll read the line. Leo took his sketchbook. He was often so inclined. He closed his eyes and painted the scenery in his mind. And of course, like you said, Leo comes back a little later with Cleo. But
Yes.
this is a very interesting thing that Bob does, which is he could have said Jack took his sketchbook. That's the name of the character. If he
Right.
wanted to like get into the cinema of it, just use the character. But he doesn't do that. He takes something from pop culture, knowing that everyone knows that what James Cameron did was make a thing that pop culture that lived forever in pop culture, right? And everyone knows Leo's in it. And so by referring to him, so he says, yeah, Leo, I don't think the song would be the same without him or the movie. People are going to say, well, that's not very truthful, but a songwriter doesn't care about what's truthful. What he cares about is what should have happened, what could have happened. That's its own kind of truth. I mean, like
Beautiful.
the way he just weaves in reality, fiction, and sort of meta fiction
Right.
all together is so interesting. And as a filmmaker, I was curious what your thoughts were on that idea and that line in particular.
Well, it's funny. I've got to bring up the Timothy Chalamet biopic, which is being filmed right now, because it's funny. People are nitpicking every production still that gets released.
That sure microphone wasn't invented for another
Yeah,
6 months.
right. The clothes look too clean. This, they're comparing it to reality and
Right.
saying this isn't right, this is wrong, this
Right.
doesn't look the way it should. And yet, no one's going to criticize him for putting Leonardo DiCaprio in his Titanic song.
Right.
So come on, you got to give James Mangold the same poetic license
There you go.
that we're giving Dylan when he puts DiCaprio on the Titanic.
Right.
Now, Henry, I have a funny story for you. I just watched the movie Titanic for the first time ever.
That's incredible.
To prep for this podcast.
I wish I could say I did the same to prep. I saw it once in high school,
and that was enough.
At a girl's house, and that was it.
Okay, well, let me tell you, I went down a little rabbit hole. So I watched this movie a couple weeks ago, and I thought it was okay. It's
okay.
It's impressive on a technical level, but it's also corny as hell. Right. And it's got this. It's very melodramatic. But one of the first things that Leonardo DiCaprio says in the movie is a verbatim quote of one of the most famous lines in Like a Rolling Stone. And this blew my mind. His first scene, he's playing a card game. His character's poor, and he wins, a trip on the Titanic in the poker game. And the line is, when you got nothing to lose. And of course, he's saying it in reference to, the hand that he's playing. But just when he said that, I couldn't believe it, because I knew it was quoting the song. And I thought, there's no way in hell James Cameron is a Bob Dylan fan. I mean, say whatever you want about James Cameron, whether you like him or not. Like, he's just not that kind of guy.
You don't think he's a Bob Dylan fan?
I know he's not. However, so I started looking into the origin of that line, and that's when I realized that film, Titanic, James Cameron is the only credited screenwriter, but someone else did an uncredited rewrite of his script.
Someone punched it up?
And do you know who that person was?
James Mangold?
No, it was Jay Cox, who wrote A Complete Unknown, the first draft of A Complete Unknown. So
what a scoop, Michael.
I know. Jay Cox also interviewed Bob Dylan in 1964 when he was in college.
Oh my God.
So he's a lifelong Dylan fan. And there is apparently some relationship between him and Dylan's office that I think has continued, over the decades, because around 2010, Jay Cox wrote a screenplay based on the song Brownsville Girl.
Oh.
And at that time, Brad Pitt was attached to star in it. I had never heard this somehow, in spite of being a huge Dylan fan,
Right.
until I was going down this rabbit hole trying to learn about Jay Cox and his uncredited rewrite of Titanic. But the Brownsville Girl screenplay, which sadly never happened, never got turned into a film, that apparently was written at the request of Bob Dylan.
Ah, okay.
So it's almost like they hired Jay Cox to
he was kind of a ringer.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing.
So just to bring it all back to that verse.
Bring it all back home.
So the fact that Dylan is dropping Leonardo DiCaprio from that movie into this song, in a way, he's sort of repaying a favor, or he's paying homage to Jay Cox, because Jay Cox did the same thing for him in that film.
Wow. Bravo. Well done. I mean, what I was going to say was just that when he said, when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose, you must have been doing the Leo meme from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
I did do that. And not only that, there are two other lines later on that I think are inspired by Dylan lyrics.
Really?
Do you want to hear them?
Yes, please.
So later on, Leo he's talking about his past, and he refers to himself as being like a tumbleweed blowing in the wind. And then, later on in the film, there's a very famous line where the old version of Kate Winslet makes a reference to a woman's heart is a deep ocean of secrets, which is very close to a line from One More Cup of Coffee. Your heart is like an ocean, mysterious and dark. Now that those aren't verbatim like the Like a Rolling Stone one, but I can't help but wonder if Jay Cox wasn't spinning Dylan records while he was punching it up. And
well, I'll give you that last one. It's kind of like how you thought the reference to Tweedledee and Tweedledum in Wonka was a Dylan reference.
Oh no, I didn't think that was. I just thought it was funny. Yeah, that was a funny coincidence.
Yeah, just a funny coincidence. That's incredible. Wow. So is he? Okay, so that's kind of, I mean, that's really meta. That's even more meta than I thought it was when I said it. Sort of like, so you think that Bob is knowingly sort of, like you said, paying it back or paying homage to Leo or to the writer or just the movie in general? That it's like the movie, you can't separate the story of the Titanic from the movie if you're post 1997.
Right.
So might as well merge them or...
So this is what I think Dylan does, and I think he does it on other songs on Tempest, and I think he did it on Rough and Rowdy Ways, which is he decides on a subject for a song, like the assassination of John Lennon, like the murder of John F. Kennedy, like Frankenstein in my own version of You, and then I think he starts watching movies, starts reading books. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind he watched Oliver Stone's JFK to prep for Murder by Foul. So I think he watches movies, he reads books, he listens to other songs about those topics, and then he lets his imagination start connecting the dots.
Right.
That's what I think he did when writing Tempest.
If I may, Michael, there is a Taylor Swift connection here with this line. So she in the song "The Man," she says, "I'd be just like Leo in Saint Tropez," which is a reference, it's kind of a jab at his famed annual Leo DiCaprio gala held in Saint Tropez, where he's a habit of vacationing with younger girlfriends and stuff. And she's kind of just for a moment to share a little intertextuality between Taylor Swift and Bob Dylan, because I know that'll either delight some people or piss some people off. So hey, here we are.
It's your podcast, buddy.
Here we are. Yeah. So do you think when Leo comes back later in the song, that's the same Leo?
I do.
Leo
I do, because he does that with a couple of other characters. The Watchman is a character who returns. The captain is mentioned across multiple verses. So it's kind of like again, it's like a movie where it's like you watch one scene with a character, then you're watching scenes with other characters, then it goes back to Leo. And the second verse in which Leo appears is probably my favorite. That's the one where he says it's about him standing in the doorway.
Another self-Dylan reference.
To prevent those from harm. And then he sings blood from an open wound pouring down his arm.
Yeah.
And that's my favorite vocal moment on the whole album, because when he sings blood from an open wound, he does that thing where he makes his voice sound like the words that he's singing. Listen to especially the phrase open wound. It sounds like he's singing through a throat full of bloody phlegm. It is the most gravelly, he growls it out.
He really does.
It's incredible.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I want to come back to this verse and the verse before it actually when Leo comes back. But I'm glad you mentioned his voice because I think one thing that we've talked about offline is how beautiful and strong his voice has been these last few years, basically since Rough and Rowdy Ways, in a way that's different than let's just say 2004 to here to 2012 or so.
Sure.
Like there is a certain level, especially when you're seeing him live, of some growling and performance wise, that's also interesting and great in its own way. But in this song, the times at which his voice is like that, it seems almost dramatic and
Yeah.
that and for effect, because he does that very soft, quiet singing, and in the same verse he'll come up and like you said,
Yeah.
open wound,
Yeah.
kind of come through it. And when re-listening to this in preparation for our conversation, I it was sort of it was maybe not the first time, but it was the first time in a long time that I thought that maybe the things he does with his voice are intentional. Not all the time,
Yeah.
but he can sing however he wants.
Right.
And obviously there's a certain level to what his voice is able to do at this point in his career after years of smoking and being on the road and singing.
Yeah.
But that certainly seemed that it was that moment and some others that seemed intentional, that when he wants to growl, he's going to growl, like Johnny Cash, like Tom Waits,
right.
kind of thing.
Well, that it's a little bit of a mystery how his voice has been seemingly rejuvenated in recent years. And I wonder if we'll ever know if it was quitting smoking, if it was, vocal cord surgery, what the hell it was. But, we were talking about those 3 albums being the trilogy of David Hidalgo.
Mm-hmm.
You could also say it's the Shredded Voice trilogy, because that is the most gravelly, Together Through Life, Christmas in the Heart, Tempest. Right. Those albums are not for the casual fan.
No, definitely not. They're for hardcore. And certainly, I remember when Modern Times came out, his voice had come back after really, because he's pretty gravelly on Love and Theft too.
Yeah.
And it works with the subject matter and the songs. But 2006, I remember Modern Times, his voice was the best it had been. I'll put best in air quotes, it had been since really 97, 98.
Well, Clinton Halen has a theory about that. If I'm allowed to bring his name up.
Lay it out.
But he may be right, which is that Love and Theft was recorded immediately after the end of a long tour. Mm-hmm. He had a long spring US tour, and then he immediately went into the studio.
And he wrote on the road.
And he recorded it. And then Modern Times, he did the opposite. He recorded it at the beginning he recorded at the beginning of the year when he had been off the road for months. So his voice had been rested. But, I mean, I'll tell you, between 2009, 2012, if you saw him live, he was kind of barking out the words. Mm-hmm. And I saw some shows during that time, and I loved them because Dylan's voice, his singing has always been about the phrasing, mm-hmm. right? Like, where does he breathe? Where does he pause? Mm-hmm. What words does he emphasize? Mm-hmm. And so on and so forth. But his voice seemed to have been kind of reduced to something where you thought that's all he can do. Right. You know what I mean? You're like, this is now his range. And then somehow, beginning around Americana Rama tour 2013, 2014, he started to sing in a more like pure tone. Mm-hmm. and
With the melody.
with a
Yeah,
melody.
yeah.
And a lot of people at the time said, "Oh, it's because the band is playing quieter, so he's not having to like shout sing over this loud blues rock band."
Hmm.
And then other people were saying, "Oh, it's because he's playing the grand piano now as opposed to a keyboard with that organ setting." And then as he did those Great American Songbook albums, he started to croon. And it's just like his voice has gotten more I don't want to say better, but it's gotten more kind of accessible, I think. You know, Seeing Dylan in Milwaukee in 2021, you were at that
It was
show,
the
right?
shock, yeah.
I
It
mean,
was shocking how
we didn't know what he
we
was
didn't
going to
know.
sound like when
Yeah.
he sang "I've Made Up My Mind to Give Myself to You." Just the way his voice was so elastic, just drawing out those notes and just swooping and soaring. It was just going all over the place, and everybody was going nuts.
Right.
Because it was like, well, is it going to sound like it does on the album? And it was better than the
Right.
album,
Right.
So we couldn't believe it, and
Right.
it's been that way ever since. To bring it back to Tempest,
please.
there is a sense that the growl of on that album, that he's deliberately leaning into it, because that album is so dark. It's so bloody. He's singing about the death of 1,600 people. So it's fitting,
Right.
and it's like the other candidate for the graveliest vocal on the album is "Pay in Blood," right? That's the darkest song.
And live, it's a growl too.
Yeah.
I remember he was just hitting you over the head with that growl.
The first line in the song is, "Well, I'm grinding my life out."
Yeah.
And so I mean, I think he's leaning into it for effect, without a doubt.
Right. Coming back to the second Leo line. So first, I wanted to mention, I made a note about the line right before that. They battened down the hatches, but the hatches wouldn't hold. They drowned upon the staircase of brass and polished gold. And the phrase "they battened down the hatches" is like one of those sayings that you just know if you read literature or watch pirate movies, or batten down the hatches, mateys, and I don't even really know what it means, but it just kind of means, I don't know, like it means something physically on a boat, literally. Maybe you know exactly what it means.
I have no clue.
It's like it's doing something to a boat when a storm's a coming, right? But I've never heard a response to it that the hatches wouldn't hold. So Bob has an understanding. I just love that like this is this phrase that I've heard in a million movies and in literature, and Bob has a response for it. And I don't think that's a saying. I don't think that's the second half of the saying, batten down the hatches. I think Bob made up a second half of the saying, which totally makes sense for this song. For some reason, when listening it just hit me like, oh, batten down the hatches, but the hatches wouldn't hold. Oh, yeah, of course not. The boat sank. So whatever the hatches are, they didn't hold, and it didn't work. So I just thought that was interesting. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there are all sorts of phrases he's using in the song describing the ship splitting apart and sinking, and it's like the propellers failed to start, and it's like, well, who's trying to start the propellers and why? It just sounds good,
right?
It paints the right image for that moment,
right?
So who cares if it's realistic or not?
It seems like a Dylan thing, though, to take a famous phrase and either twist it a little bit or create something more out of it. That seemed like a very 1965 Bob Dylan thing to do, like a "just like a woman" type of thing. To like take a famous phrase and futz with it. And so I don't know. I just that really stood out to me. I really enjoyed that. So then on the second Leo line, as you said, Leo said to Cleo, "I think I'm going mad," but he'd lost his mind already, whatever mind he had. So in the first Leo line, it's clearly a reference to Leo DiCaprio. Right? He's got this famous scene. But here, Leo said to Cleo, "I think I'm going mad." Here now, Bob is like sort of creating his own story with this character. I don't recall. You saw the movie more recently, but I don't recall anything in particular that refers to that
No,
in the
no.
movie.
And well, there's not a character named Cleo in the
Right.
movie
Right.
either. I mean, is that a reference to the Kate Winslet character?
Right.
Or did he just need a rhyme with Leo?
Right. Right.
Who knows?
Right. I mean, and it works.
So
Yeah.
so again, I think he's taking the idea of Leonardo DiCaprio from that movie, and he does talk about him having a sketchbook, being
Right.
an artist. So it is a reference to the character, but he's spinning his own version of that character in this song.
Do you think that this song is a movie? Do you see it cinematically as a filmmaker yourself and as a just a person who absorbs media and writing and
Well,
books and movies and
I don't.
do you when you read it, when you listen to it, do you see it like a movie or
I think it's as much it's an epic ballad. It's a story song. So it could be a movie, but it could also be, an epic poem or a
Mhm,
novel,
mhm, mhm,
or
mhm. Short
um
story? Yeah.
or a short story collection,
Right.
where all of the stories are intertwined. It's kind of all of those things,
Hmm, hmm.
I think.
Yeah, I mean, something is clearly happening in Bob's head where he likes, these sort of long stories. Where do you think it fits in with the canon of long Bob songs? So we're talking Murder Most Foul,
Yeah.
Highlands, this. Um, I can give you the top 10 if you'd like.
Desolation
So
Row,
we've got
Sad-Eyed Lady,
Joey.
Joey, yeah, another story song.
Yeah, I won't tell Rob Kelly. We mentioned Joey. Brownsville Girl, Tin Angel, off the same album.
Yeah.
Lily Rosemary and the Jack of Hearts, and Ain't Talking.
Yeah. Wow, that's the top 10.
That's
Ain't
top.
ain't talking cracks the top
Yeah, because
10.
it's like 7 or 8 minutes long.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
those
surprising.
are his top 10 longest songs.
Well, the interesting thing is some of those songs are stories and some are not.
Right.
Like Desolation Row is not.
Free bowling, 60s.
It's a poem.
Yeah.
It's more abstract.
Right.
And then something like Joey is more of a clear narrative. I think what he does.
Born in Red Hook, Brooklyn.
Yeah, it's birth to death.
Right.
It's one character.
Yeah.
But I think
Lily Rosemary is, although it's sort of like a blood on the tracks-y type of storytelling, it has a
pretty clear
yeah.
Narrative. It's got multiple narratives.
Right.
But
right, they're all there in the title.
Yeah, they're all there. Those are the characters.
Yeah.
So I think what Tempest does that's interesting, it kind of merges those two impulses.
Mm-hmm.
It's like half abstract poetic and half and philosophical.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's also characters and story. He's kind of mixing those two things together, I think.
So then where in the canon of long songs do you think it stands?
I would put it at the top. I mean, I would put I think Murder Most Foul is probably my favorite of those, but I would put Tempest right underneath it. Tempest and Sad-Eyed Lady and Desolation Row. I think those four would be my favorite.
It's a great top four of so I did want to say something about the last stanza, but before we get to that, are there any other stanzas you wanted to touch on that really stand out to you?
I do. So earlier we were talking about the idea that the song could be sung in a celebratory manner by people who were upset about the segregationist policies of this ship. And I think we see that attitude today. I was listening to this song a lot last year when the submersible imploded, the Titan, because I noticed a lot of people on social media were making jokes about it.
Oh yeah.
And I thought that was an interesting phenomenon. And it goes back to what we were saying a few minutes ago. It was like almost this Schadenfreude being expressed because the people who died were all billionaires.
Right.
And it was kind of like they got what they deserved. They wanted to do this disaster tourism, and they ended up being they were kind of like the final victims of the Titanic. They became part of that.
It's sort of
became part of the disaster story.
It's sort of biblical, like you said earlier. Like it's sort of like or Icarus,
Right? Yeah. It's like, oh, you wanted to see what happened to
now
those
you're really
people.
going to see it.
Now you're gonna see it better than anyone.
Right.
And I think a lot of people who were making those jokes were kind of, younger people, Gen Z. I think a lot of college students, and they do have a point to an extent. I mean, obviously, it's a tragedy, when almost anybody dies. But I do understand the point that around the same time there was a ship full of refugees. I think going from somewhere in Africa to somewhere in Europe that sank, and a lot of people died, way more than
Yes.
were on the submersible. And so a lot of people were making the point, why isn't this in the headlines?
Mhm.
The media only cares about, the death of the rich. It's only treated like a tragedy. It's only treated newsworthy if it's people who are super rich. So I understand the outrage about that. But I want to say, I think Dylan's point of view as the author of this song is the opposite of that. When he's singing about the Titanic, he's basically saying this is the way life is. And everybody who died on the ship, it doesn't matter if they were rich or they were poor. It was just their time to go. And it's not because God was punishing anybody. In fact, I think there's one stanza that really seems to sum up what I consider to be Dylan's philosophy, which is
They waited at the landing and they tried
to understand
but there is no understanding on the judgment
of God's hand. So what he's saying is you can never understand why things happen. And so God doesn't punish the wicked. He doesn't reward the virtuous here on earth. That's what I think Dylan's point of view is. And I think that ties back to something he said in the Rolling Stone interview when Love and Theft came out. Do you remember when he told Michael Gilmore God is arbitrary? And Michael Gilmore acted confused.
Yeah.
And he was like, wait, I thought most people think of God as being unchanging and stable. And Dylan says, yeah, I agree with that. And then Michael Gilmore's like, I don't understand what you mean by arbitrary. And Dylan says, look it up in the dictionary.
You gotta come with your boxing gloves on when you interview Bob Dylan.
But I never understood what Dylan meant by arbitrary until I started meditating on that verse. And I think what he means, and of course I could be wrong, but I think what he means is that when something happens that's a tragedy, and we think that it somehow is the judgment of God, it's happening arbitrarily, not because anyone deserved it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways this is this epic tragedy, but also everyone was on equal footing,
right. Yeah, he goes out of his way to point out that there were poor people on the ship, the good, the bad, the rich, the poor, the loveliest and the best.
Right. And maybe to God it's arbitrary. I mean,
right.
Who
It's just a bunch of people who happen to be on that ship.
Right. And and God, obviously, Bob's saying judgment of God's hand. The way he's referring to God is in a very biblical sense, and in the way that people at that time, and obviously many people now, think of God and experience God. Who knows what Bob thinks of God, but he's making a reference to the character of God.
Absolutely.
As my wife likes to say when referring to the biblical God. The character of God here is it might be judgmental, might be vengeful, but in the case of the Titanic, perhaps just arbitrary.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Well, here's how I would phrase it. To quote Nick Cave, I don't think that the God in the song is an interventionist God.
Interventionist.
Yes.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
That's the opening line of a Nick Cave song. I don't believe in an interventionist God.
Oh, that's great. I'll have to check that out. That's awesome. Any other stanzas that stood out to you?
No, why don't you lay one on me?
All right. So, there were a couple more that felt very haunting and biblical in ways, like when the reaper's task had ended, 1,600 had gone to rest. The good, the bad, the rich, the poor, the loveliest and the best. Bob putting the word lovely in that horrific verse, it's like only Bob Dylan can do that.
Yeah.
Just the dichotomy of horror and beauty. He's just so good at that. And of course, obviously we're not hitting ourselves over the head with that metaphor, and that the Titanic was that. It was this great modern achievement that ended up being a horror. But
Yeah.
the loveliest could refer to people, could be the Titanic itself. So I really liked that one. I wanted to say something about the last verse, and this, we don't have to stop here, but tell me what you think about this. So the watchman, he lay dreaming
Mm.
of all things that can be. He dreamed the Titanic sinking into the deep blue sea. I was thinking about the idea of this being a dream,
Yes.
that maybe either, Bob Dylan dream, or our dream, or
Or the watchman on the
the
Titanic
one, yeah,
dream.
whomever, a survivor of because there were those, obviously, as we know from the James Cameron movie, and it's interesting to me because the song, unlike other songs of his, is not dreamlike. It's very, seems straightforward. There is metaphor, and there is, of course, um um imagery that is not necessarily linear happening, but I was just really interested that this was the idea of that this could be a dream, that did come true, actually.
Yeah, that's one of the most fascinating aspects of the song. I should point out that the character of the Watchman does appear in the Carter family song, the Titanic, and they do mention him dreaming, but they mention it once, in a fairly short song. He
Hmm.
brings the character up again and again. He does it, I think, 4 times, and describes the character as dreaming every time.
Hmm.
So you have to wonder, does this justify, is this what gives Dylan the poetic license to create
Right.
fictional
Right.
scenarios?
Right.
He describes people killing each other on the Titanic. Brother rose up against
Against brother.
brother
Yeah.
in every circumstance. They fought and slaughtered each other in a deadly dance. I mean, he knows that didn't happen, but in that sense, it makes the song feel like a metaphor. It
Hmm.
feels like
Hmm.
this is life. The ship itself is the world. The
Hmm.
people on it are, it's everybody.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
all these things that happen, it's like there are acts of bravery, there are acts of kindness. I love that verse. Jim Dandy
Hmm.
smiled. He never learned to swim,
Hmm.
saw the little crippled child and gave his seat to him. I cried once while listening to that. um, in the year 2020. I was listening to this a lot when I was waiting for waiting for Rough and Rowdy Ways to come out. I did kind of a deep dive into Tempest again because I was kind of starved for
Hmm.
original Dylan songs, and that stanza hit me like a ton of bricks.
Hmm.
So he's describing, people do good deeds, people do bad deeds. He describes characters as traitors and turncoats.
Hmm.
And you're right, there's a lot of very concrete images like mothers and their daughters
Hmm.
descended down the stairs, jumped into the icy waters. Love and pity sent their prayers. That's pretty disturbing,
It's,
you
yeah,
know.
and it's very descriptive of what happened. It's not
Yeah,
metaphor.
right.
It's,
Exactly. It's very concrete.
yeah.
So by describing the Watchman as dreaming, it's almost like that allows him to say anything he wants
Hmm.
because it's the whole thing is a dream.
Yeah.
And
So
uh
do you think, in within the world of this song, do you think this song is a dream?
I do, but I also think life is a dream.
Mm.
There's now, since you brought up Taylor Swift, I have to bring up Twin Peaks,
Okay.
which is something I'm obsessed with. But
Yeah.
there's a line in that show where someone says, "We are like the dreamer who dreams and then lives inside the dream."
Mm.
And that's something that has always resonated with me. I think that life is a dream, and I think, when you especially if you're an artist, when you make a work of art, the the idea is born first in your brain,
Mm.
and then as soon as you tell it to another person or write it down, it leaves your head, and you bring the dream to life. And then if you're collaborating with other people, it's like you're all kind of living inside the dream. And I think that's what it must have been like for Dylan to write this song and then to, play it with his band.
You know how he said in you know how he says in No Direction Home basically about how writing those songs in the 60s, it was like God had he said, you try writing those, it was
Yeah.
almost like something spoke to him otherworldly. And it's not that it bothers me. I think he's right in that, but I think things like this are like that too. I think there is a spark of the divine
Yeah.
inside of him when he writes something like this.
Yeah.
Because first of all, just the absolute stamina it takes to write this and then sing it
Yeah.
in the studio. I mean, and I think so. I think like just the physical requirements that it has is divine. Like and to write these kind of words, I think that there's almost no other way to explain it. Like
Yeah.
that, how at that age, and did he do this? And obviously we said that again 8 years later with Rough and Rider Ways, and we're still saying it. That how is it possible? So I'm really like blown away by the kind of high level of this song. It's not just a long story song.
Right.
There's so much more to it, and
it contains the whole world.
Yeah,
in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that phrase, the spark of the divine. And I think that you're right. And I think the truth is, I think a lot of people feel that spark, but Bob Dylan is one of the few people who has the talent and the discipline to, turn it into a 45
Right.
stanza song.
Yes.
and the courage to think that he can do it and that he should do it,
It's the courage. He's like, I'm going to put this on this album.
Yeah.
If only he would play it live.
Yeah. And I don't care what anybody thinks.
Right.
It's like, and then he does the same thing with JFK.
Right.
Like, I'm going to do a deep dive into this real life tragedy.
Right. I wanted to mention one more stanza before we start to wrap it up. The bishop left his cabin to help all those in need, turned his eyes up to the heavens, said the poor are yours to feed. Turned his eyes up to the heavens appears in another Bob Dylan song.
Frankie and Albert.
Frankie and Albert, which is not a Bob Dylan song. But to my earlier point about the folk tradition and taking things, and you mentioned also taking parts of movies and books and songs and putting them into your own work. I couldn't think of any other Dylan songs where he says the exact same line in two different songs. Off the top of your head, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
what do you mean where he takes a line from a folk song and puts
from
it
his own song? Like, I'm counting Frankie and Albert as his own song in this case because it's in his, it's he recorded it and he changed it a little bit.
Yeah.
So I can't think of any other times that he's done them. There are certainly words that he likes to use a lot and parts of phrases, but like to take a full verse and put it in another song, I wonder if this is something that seeped into his subconscious from the knowing that song and knowing the folk tradition. Maybe it's a song, maybe it's a phrase that is used in many folk songs, or is he on purpose using a line that he liked from a song he had previously recorded? It's a wondering.
Well, there's one that's close. In Hurricane, there's the line, he said, "Wait a minute, boys, this one's not dead." The phrase, he said, "Wait a minute, boys," crops up in Murder Best Foul.
Oh, okay.
Which is interesting. But that's kind of like part of a line.
So that might be the closest.
That might be the closest. Yeah. But the line from Frankie and Albert is incredible because the line is, turned her eyes up to the heavens, said, "Nearer, my God, to thee."
Mm-hmm.
He's describing Frankie on the scaffold after having murdered her lover, Albert, and looking up to heaven and saying, "Nearer, my God, to thee." "Nearer, my God, to thee" was the song that the band allegedly played on the Titanic. So by Dylan quoting Frankie and Albert, but not including that part, it's like a genius meta reference.
It's like his own deep cut of himself.
Yes, yes. It's like mentioning your "My God to Thee" would be too obvious.
Right, right.
So he does it in an indirect way.
Right.
So I love that. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Anything else about this song? Any other stanzas or anything you want to say about just your personal love of it? I'll be honest, Michael. I've never, I mean, you are surprising in many wonderful ways.
Yeah.
I've never met someone, a Dylan fan, who like is a stan, to borrow,
Yeah.
phrases from the kids, for Tempest. So bravo.
Well, I thought it was a
You're
good
always full of surprises.
I thought it was a good first song for your podcast, because I think it is still to a certain extent underrated. It seems like when Murder Most Foul came out, everyone acclaimed it as almost everybody said this is
Yeah.
a major work, and I think Tempest is at the same level or near the same level, and it doesn't have the same reputation. So if your podcast can do anything to try and rehabilitate it a little bit, that'll be great. And I hope he plays it live. I mean, it doesn't seem like something he would do, but the thing about Dylan is, like, you have to expect the unexpected. So hopefully we'll see him do it live someday.
Maybe someday. So that brings someday, baby. That another one he hasn't played live. That brings me to my exit question for you. You can either hear Tempest or Murder Most Foul live. Which one and why? In your dream scenario, you're out of Dylan's show, whether it's the only song he plays of the night, or it's the closer, or it's half of a show, you can either hear Murder Most Foul or Tempest.
I picked Tempest. And I think Murder Most Foul is probably the greater song of the two, although in my opinion they're both masterpieces. So why quibble? But here's why I'd rather hear Tempest. I think the melody in Tempest is awesome. Now, you talked about how it's simple. It's just a few chords that repeat over and over again. But that's what makes it hypnotic.
Right.
It
lulls you into it seems familiar, like you've heard it before.
Yeah, I mean, and he does that on other songs on the album Tempest, like Long and Wasted Years. It's just that descending guitar line that just repeats. Or Tin Angel. Tin Angel is it's very simple musically. But what's great about Tempest is his singing. He sings the hell out of it. And he doesn't always sing the vocal melody the same. Like, sometimes his voice goes up at the end of a line, sometimes it goes down, and you never know which way it's going to go. Like, I was listening to the song earlier today, and it really blew me away when he sings the line, "There were many, many others, nameless here forevermore," and like he goes up on forevermore. And it was the exact right way to sing that word. And of course, he didn't plan it that way. That's just what comes out of him. You know what I mean? And so if he were to do it live, it wouldn't be exactly like the album, but it would still be full of surprises in the way he sings it on the album is full of surprises.
Great. Well, it's your question, so that's great. Amazing. Well, Michael, where can folks find you on the internet, or wherever you'd like them to find you?
Well, I forgot to renew the domain name for my website, whitecitycinema.com. So I think Instagram and Twitter, my handle is the same. My username is White City Cinema, like Devil in the White City. And so that's the best place to find me.
Great. Awesome. Is there anything you'd like to plug, or anything in your filmmaking world?
Absolutely. Well, Henry, I do have a movie called Relative, which I made back in 2022, which you saw the Chicago premiere of at the Music Box Theater. That film is going to be made available to stream via Music Box Films beginning on May 21st. I'm not sure if that will be...
It'll be before we launch. So,
perfect. Yeah. So May 21st, you can rent it and buy it on digital across a whole bunch of platforms.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank Thank you so much. This was a blast, and I can't wait to hear all of your future episodes.
Yeah, well, we'll have to do it again and have you on for another future episode. Start thinking about another song from Tempest. No, just kidding.
Anytime, buddy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to my guest, Michael Glover Smith. Please look for the next episode of Songs of Experience on the first day of the month, found in all of your podcast feeds. Please give us a follow on Twitter at Songs of Bob. If you're subscribing on Apple Podcasts, please take a moment to give us a rating and review so we can spread the word a little more. If you'd like to see a video version of this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@songsofbobdylan. You can, of course, email us at songsofbobdylan@gmail.com. Lastly, this show would not exist without the freewheelin' Rob Kelly and Pod Dylan. Thank you for originating the format and giving me your blessing to continue the conversation. You can check out all past episodes of Pod Dylan on all of your podcast feeds. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.